be invited as a speaker here, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and responses to what I have to say uh, today. This is also my first time speaking to a Bangladeshian, but I heard people from several countries joining, so my first time speaking to such an audience. So I'm very curious to hear also your distinctive insights on these matters. Um, right. So today I will talk about responsibility voids and collective obligations. And this, what I will have to say today is partially based on joint work also with co-authors on several papers, Allard Tamminga and Frederick van der Putte. Although, of course, all the errors and mistakes and glitches are, of course, all my responsibility today and not theirs. Okay, so when it comes to responsibility voids, I think it's useful to start with a couple of sort of salient cases or literatures where these issues have popped up. And one of them has to do with black box algorithms. So nowadays it's kind of hard to imagine that back in 2004 this was still a sort of niche topic. Nowadays, I think many people are working or concerned about black box algorithms. But back in 2004, Matthias already was speaking of the so-called responsibility gap, which had to do with situations where there's increasing class of machine actions, where the sort of traditional ways of ascribing responsibility are not really compatible with our sense of justice or our moral framework. And it is such that nobody really has enough control to assume responsibility for these machine actions. And sort of one of the reasons to think that this might be the case is that, well, these learning algorithms, they go on a learning trajectory that makes it really hard to predict how they will and when they will sort of break down and function in ways as they're not intended to function. So think about self-driving cars that make a mistake and they classify an object as sort of maybe like a conspicuous rock, even though it's actually a person, and that sort of leads to all sorts of harms. These sort of image recognition systems can behave in ways that are unpredictable, and that may sort of hinder or block our traditional ways of ascribing responsibility. Of course, similar situations can occur in, again, something that has been discussed widely in the literature, but is more prominent today, the situation of autonomous weapons where autonomous systems can sort of, well, decide to engage with certain targets, and that can leave a responsibility gap where at least no human can be reasonably, or at least not according to our traditional means of ascribing responsibility, nobody can be held responsible. Now, a second situation where this has come up is in the so-called problem of many hands. So Thompson famously has this paper on the moral responsibility of public officials. So in public institutions, there's also commonly a lot of actors that sort of contribute in minor or insignificant ways or have only a minor or irrelevant role in sort of bringing about certain institutions or institutional arrangements. And none of these, or at least some argue, none of these can be held accountable, or at least not according to our sort of traditional ways of ascribing responsibility. And that leaves leaves an issue because sort of intuitively you would like to be able to hold someone accountable. I should say here that Thompson actually argues that there are ways to still sort of use the concept of personal responsibility in these cases, and that it applies more widely than is commonly thought. But this is a situation in which at least prima facie there might be an issue. And I maybe should say, so this is the second example before moving on to the next, but before moving on to the outline of the talk, but that maybe a third issue or a third context where this plays a role, and that's I'm triggered by a workshop that I attended yesterday, which was on structural injustice. And also in the case of structural injustice, many people think that often, or at least in certain significant cases, there are no really individuals at fault when there is a structural injustice. It's basically because of the structure of the situation that certain groups are disadvantaged and certain other groups are advantaged. So that might also be a case in which no individuals can be held responsible, or maybe not sufficiently many can be held responsible, so that it doesn't really align with our sense of justice. So those are the three situations in which these responsibility voids are or take up a prominent role in different debates. So today, what I will talk about is the following. So the first two parts are more conceptual. The third and fourth are slightly more formal, and then I end with a recap and conclusions. So the first two parts are about the problem of responsibility void. So I try to zoom in a bit more on what exactly is the problem here. How can we sort of conceptually analyze that? And then in the second part, I relate these problems to questions about individualism and collective obligations. And then in the third and fourth part, I sort of use or develop a formal theory using game models and modal logic to operationalize obligations and responsibility. And that actually paves the way for proving an impossibility result that basically says that collective obligations cannot be reduced to individual obligations, or phrased differently, there might be situations in which a group is collectively responsible, even though none of the individual members of the group are individually responsible. All right, and then I'll end with recap. So that's the plan for today. All right, the problem of responsibility voids. So as a sort of first definition, I think we can say that responsibility void is a situation in which something morally undesirable happens or occurs that results out of the interaction of several individuals, even though none of them can be held responsible. So it's a sort of impossibility of assigning responsibility to any individual human being. Now, this responsibility voice basically comes in two versions. So one is it might be that actually there are individuals that like an omniscient person would be able to sort of figure out who is individually responsible, but we face this practical difficulty. Like, given the structure of the situation, it's so hard. The situation is so complex for us limited beings. We're unable to figure out who these morally responsible individuals are. And then there's a second version, which is that no, even if you were an omniscient being, you could still not find any individual who's individually responsible. So there's a sheer sort of conceptual lack of human responsibility. I think it's important to draw these two apart. And for the most of what I will have to say, I'll focus on the second one. So not this practical difficulty, but the sheer absence. Like there truly is no human that is responsible, that can be held responsible in these situations. Now, I should also say that maybe not all responsibility voids are morally problematic, right? There might be morally undesirable outcomes that result out of the interaction of several individuals, and none of them can be held responsible, but maybe it's not really a problem. So one example that's sometimes mentioned is a stampede that's sort of triggered by a fluke accident. If something happens and a large crowd goes on a stampede, that means that an undesirable outcome results out of the interaction of several individuals, but none of these individuals can be held responsible because it was basically just due to a fluke accident, and that sort of triggered this stampede. So that's just to say that, and I'll bracket this and also mention this as an open question at the end, a significant one, I think. We need to think a little bit more clearly about, or more hard about, the question of can we sort of demarcate which responsibility voids are problematic and which ones are not? And this is a really hard question to answer. It's difficult to find a satisfying answer to this question. Like yesterday, I was at a workshop again on structural injustice, and many people were struggling with with the question of what exactly is wrong with a structural injustice, especially if nobody individually is doing anything wrong. So philosophers are really struggling to find out like what exactly is it that is problematic in these situations. Okay, just to flag that that's an open issue. Okay, so here's I tried to come up with a kind of clean scenario where people have argued that there are these responsibility voids. So here's a situation of a committee making a decision. So consider a three-member court that is to decide on a breach of contract case. And suppose the legal doctrine requires that the court is to decide on three basic preconditions. The first one is that the defendant did the action. Second one is that the action goes against the contract. And C, the third one is that the contract was valid at the time. And let's suppose that the person is liable if and only if all these three preconditions are met. Now assume that this committee takes this premise-based procedure. So for each of these premises, they've tried to figure out whether a majority thinks that's the case, right? So they go by each of these premises, and then they sort of derive their collective judgment by their majority judgments on these premises. Now you might end up in a situation that's sort of illustrated in the table on the right, where if you go through the columns, you see that everybody but Judy thinks that the defendant did the action. Everybody but James thinks that the action goes against the contract. Everybody but Jill thinks the contract was valid at the time. Now, for each of these premises, you have a majority who thinks that it's the case. So the group judgment is yes, the person is liable. But actually, none of these individual judges thinks that the person is liable, and each for a different reason. Judy thinks the defendant did not do the action, etc., etc. You see how the case works. Now, this is a famous example that Christian List and Philip Pettit have used in their book on group agency to argue that this is a case of a responsibility void, and maybe we need a notion of a collective responsibility in order to sort of solve these issues that might arise. Now, you might think, oh, this is maybe only due to the way this group decided to make their collective decision, namely by endorsing this premise-based procedure. But actually, you can show, and Christian List and Pettit argue that you can sort of generalize this case to any sort of procedure that the group might endorse. So they rely on, if you're familiar with the literature on judgment aggregation, they sort of refer to impossibility results with regards to judgment aggregation to argue that in this case, you can always, or for any procedure, you can end up in a situation where you have let's say a responsibility void, where the group does something, but none of the individuals can be held responsible. Okay. Oh, and I should say, to sort of trigger the right intuitions here, let's suppose that the verdict is not correct, right? So let's suppose the person is actually not liable. Then we're trying to look for what went wrong, who can be held responsible, but in this case, none of the individuals can. Okay, now I want to make set apart a separate kind of case. So aside from responsibility voids, I also want to talk about what I call collective responsibility gaps. So responsibility voids, as I already alluded to, are often used to motivate an irreducible notion of collective responsibility. So that means a notion of collective responsibility that does not sort of reduce to individual responsibilities. Of course, not all responsibility voids might be of this nature, right? There might be there might be responsibility voids in which it does not really make sense to sort of think that there is a collective to be held collectively responsible, but there might be cases where there are. And the collective responsibility gap then is a situation where the first condition is that you have a void. As I mentioned earlier, a morally undesirable outcome results out of the interaction of several individuals, even though none of them can be held responsible. And then the second condition is that the group is actually fit to be held responsible. So this would be a case in which you have collective responsibility without any individual responsibility. Now you might want to analyze these cases, like, can it actually happen? Can these collective responsibility gaps occur? And for this, I think it's helpful to sort of pick apart different kind of components of a theory of responsibility. Let me put it that way. So when you think about what people have written about responsibility, usually what people argue is that there is this sort of causal element. So in order to be responsible, to hold someone, how do you say that? So in order for someone to be responsible for for something, the person had to play a causal role in that outcome coming about. Because if they played no causal role in it, then it's really hard to imagine how they could be held, at least morally, responsible. But then on top of that, we also often think of intentional or epistemic elements that play a role in our uh, theories of responsibility. So, for instance, you have cases of malice where an actor actually intentionally brought about certain bad outcomes. But you also have like a step below that. You have a case of foresight where the actor foresaw that their actions would have such bad consequences. And below that, you would have a case of recklessness where the actor was aware that their action would bring about a significant risk. Wouldn't guarantee it, but would bring about a significant risk of certain bad outcomes. And then you have negligence. That's a case where the actor was unaware of the circumstances and failed to inform themselves of the risks of their actions. And this is sort of also related to legal theory in like criminal law. People have uh, well, have sort of pointed out these elements also in criminal law and also in logics of responsibility and obligation. People have also tried to distinguish these different let's say elements in a theory of responsibility. So it's good to be aware that this is well, that the sort of theories of responsibility usually have these sorts of elements in place. Now, I want to do a little bit of self-promotion. So it was already mentioned. So I published this monograph, The Logic of Responsibility Voids. So in this book, I actually investigate the possibility and scope of the problem of the responsibility voids. And one of the characteristics is that I take this pluralistic perspective and go over all these different elements. So one might have a theory of responsibility that only sort of says, oh, you're responsible only if you act with malice. And then you can think about, oh, what happens to responsibility voids? Are they more or less likely? Under which conditions can they happen? These sorts of questions. And in this book, I offer a unifying framework for modeling moral responsibility by drawing on modal logic and game theory. You will see some of that later in the talk. And in this framework, I characterize conditions under which responsibility voids are also ruled out. So they can happen, but sometimes it's useful to know what are the sort of necessary conditions that need to be in place for responsibility voids to potentially arise. And if you think that once we know these conditions, we can perhaps sort of create our institutions to sort of avoid that these conditions arise and in that way sort of circumvent the problem of responsibility voids. Okay, now I want to move on to the second part on individualism and collective obligations. So yeah, let me just jump right in. So here's two concepts. One is about agency or action, what agents do or bring about, and another concept about what agents ought to do, like the obligations that they have. Now, we might ask several questions about how like collective agency relates to individual agency and how collective oughts relate to individual oughts. So for instance, we may ask, if agents I and j together see to it that phi collectively, is it then also the case that agent I sees to it that phi and agent j sees to it that phi individually? And similarly, but reversed, is it the case that agents I sees to it that phi and agent j sees to it that phi individually, that then also agents I and j together see to it that phi collectively? So these are questions about how sort of questions at the collective level relate to questions at the individual level. Similarly, with regards to odds, we can ask, is it the case that if agents I and j together ought to see to it that phi collectively, that then also agent I ought to see to it that phi, and also agent j ought to see to it that phi individually? And vice versa, is it the case that if agent I ought to see to it that phi and agent j ought to see to it that phi both individually, that then also agent I and j together ought to see to it that phi collectively? And you can get a similar set of questions when you move to responsibility. So here, if we sort of assume a link between responsibility and obligations that goes as follows, that one can only be held morally responsible if and when one doesn't fulfill all their obligations. And we can ask, when it comes to obligations, we can ask, oh, if agents I and J together fulfill their collective obligation, does that entail that agent I fulfills their individual obligation and agent J also fulfills their individual obligation? And likewise, but vice versa, if agent I fulfills her obligations and agent J fulfills her individual obligations, is it then also the case that agents I and J together fulfill their collective obligation? And this second one relates to collective responsibility gaps by sort of taking the contrapositive, because this question is basically equivalent under the assumption stated above. It's equivalent to the question, is it the case that if agents I and J together can be held collectively responsible, that then also either agent I or agent J can be held individually responsible? If the answer to that question is no, then that means that you can have collective responsibility without any member being individually responsible. So that would mean that you have a collective responsibility gap. So basically, these are all questions that are sort of this nature, and they relate to individualism, where individualism can be understood as the thesis that every social phenomena can or must be explained in terms of the actions and interactions of individuals. So for instance, collective responsibility can or must be explained in terms of individual responsibility. So you have sort of concepts at the social level or at the collective level, and it's a question of how they relate to uh, facts or concepts at the individual level. So this is sort of the broader conceptual scheme that's in place with individualism. So individualism basically says, yes, you always need to be able to sort of go from the social level to the individual level. Now, let me think. So one of the key elements in this thesis of individualism is the notion of an explanation. So I want to say a little bit more about what that might mean. So basically, they take explanations to be reductive. An individualist would take this explanation to be reductive. And an explanation, what is that? Well, basically, we can view an explanation as a binary relation of consisting of an explanandum, which describes some sort of social phenomenon like collective responsibility, and an explanans that describes the individualistic sentences which purportedly at least account for the social phenomenon. Now, what is immediately obvious is that, well, the validity of methodological individualism or individualism depends on the expressive power of the individualistic language in question. So if we can only allude to certain individual facts, then if that is more restricted, then of course we cannot account for certain things. But if that is more, if that's wider, if that's more expressive, then we might be able to account for more social phenomena. So that's one note to take in mind. Now, what I want to do in the next couple of slides is I want to introduce a notion that I call logical regularity. So I'll move to a definition. This is sort of foreshadowing what is to come. I'm going to move to a definition. So I want you to hold your patience for a minute. And then I will argue that this notion of logical regularity is often assumed or implied in many prominent models of explanation. So basically what this means is that this notion of a logical regularity is a sort of necessary requirement for individualism to obtain. So let me take a step back. So individualism requires that you are able to explain social phenomena in terms of individual phenomena or individual facts. Now, depending on how you fill in the details of what an explanation is or what is required for an explanation to be successful, it depends on what is actually required here in this for individualism to be true. Now, I want to say it doesn't really matter. All of these theories require that there is a logical regularity between the social phenomena that is to be explained and the individualistic sentences that are purportedly accounting for this social phenomena. And then in the next step, I want to argue that such a logical regularity cannot obtain. So if such a logical regularity cannot obtain, then none of these forms of explanation can succeed. That's the basic structure of the argument. Okay. So then let's move to a notion of logical regularity. So let's start with, well, one of the first models of explanation that's maybe not widely endorsed anymore, but it's a useful place to start. And that's a deductive nomological model of explanation. And this model says, well, a successful explanation takes the form of a sound deductive argument. So that's condition one. Condition two is that the individualistic premises must include and essentially involve a general law. And then the third one is that there has to be some empirical testability of the claim. Now, for my purposes, all that matters is this first condition, which is the requirement that this connection between the individualistic explanans and the social explanandum, that has to take the form of a sound deductive argument. So let's call that a requirement of deductive sufficiency. You can also think of a sort of reverse case of deductive necessity. So A is deductively necessary for B if and only if there is a deductive argument from B to A. And this notion of the necessity actually aligns with at least simple theories of counterfactual, like counterfactual theories of causation. Now I want to sort of draw this out in pictures so that it's maybe easier to process. And for that, I want to allude to a common framework in philosophy of possible worlds. So imagine you have a set of all possible worlds here on the slide, the big, well, almost rectangle. And you have a set gamma, which is a set of facts, and the circle of gamma basically signifies those possible worlds in which all the facts in gamma obtain. Right? So all the possible worlds outside of gamma are worlds in which gamma is not the case. Likewise for psi. Then deductive sufficiently basically means, so gamma is deductively sufficient for psi if and only if this set of worlds in which gamma is the case is included in the set of worlds in which psi is the case. So you get this sort of set inclusion of possible worlds. Likewise, when it comes to necessity, the picture is reversed. So here's necessity. So gamma is deductively necessary for psi if and only if, when you look at these sets of worlds, the set of worlds in which gamma is the case includes or like encompasses all the worlds in which psi is the case. Right? So you get this set inclusion again. Please raise your voice if something is unclear. Stop me, just raise clarificatory questions. Especially online, it's pretty hard to know whether people are still on board or dropped out. Yeah. Right. So this is the first model, deductive nomological model. Now, there's other models of explanation. So here's, for instance, so many philosophers take explanation to also involve causal information, and then there's different models of causality. You have regularity models of causality. Regularity models of causation, they often refer to so-called nest conditions. A nest condition, what is that? Well, C is a nest condition for E if and only if C is a necessary element of a set of jointly sufficient conditions for E. So that's quite a mouthful. I'll have a picture of that in a moment. But I just want to say for now that you can make a similar move, like reversed kind of, where you have Sezin conditions that are similar to the necessary conditions we had before. Now, maybe a side note here, a side note about regularity theories of causation. So these nest conditions are too broad, they apply too often. So these theories of regularity, they often require that these nest conditions be minimized in some way to exclude spurious or accidental relations. But for us, that doesn't really matter because all that I'm looking for is something that is implied by these theories of explanation. Okay, so in a picture, what is a nest condition? So here, phi is a Nest condition for psi. Why is that? Well, there is a set gamma such that sort of when we restrict the set of possible worlds to gamma, then every gamma world satisfying phi is also one that satisfies psi. So that means the intersection of gamma and phi is included in the intersection, or is included in psi, right? So the intersection of the red and the green is inside the yellow circle here. And then there's two other conditions that sort of try to ensure that we don't have trivial cases. So gamma is not itself a sufficient condition for psi. Otherwise, phi is not really playing any role anymore. And similarly, gamma is not a sufficient condition for not psi. So if gamma already sort of rules out phi, then it's no longer playing any role in the explanation. Intuitively, what you could say as well, phi is maybe not sufficient for psi, but it's approximately sufficient. It's sufficient only in the condition under the condition gamma. So when we would restrict the possible worlds to only gamma worlds, then phi would be sufficient for psi. That's maybe one way to think about this. Okay, so my notion of logical regularity is basically as follows. So there is a logical regularity between phi and psi relative to some language if one of the following five conditions is met. Either phi is a necessary and sufficient condition for psi, or it's a sufficient condition, or it's a necessary condition, or it's a Nest condition, or it's what I call the Sezin condition. This is inspired by the work of Mahoney, wrote a book on the logic of the social sciences. He doesn't make this argument, but I think one can make the argument that this is a useful notion in the sense that basically all prominent models of explanation assume or imply that there is a logical regularity. Okay, so that's on the next slide. So this is my main claim, and I can maybe say, so I'm not going to say a lot more about this here in the talk, but if you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So my main claim is that many prominent models of successful reductive explanation assume or imply that there must be a logical regularity between the social explanandum and the individualistic explanants. So for instance, when it comes to these regularity theories of causation, they often use some sort of minimized Nest conditions, but these of course are Nest conditions, so that means that there is a logical regularity. Similarly, you can argue that counterfactual theories of causation and interventionist theories of causation, that they also require either a necessary or a Nest condition. Okay. Now, at the end of the talk, I will, or at least one of the main claims of the talk is an impossibility result, which says that there is no logical regularity between facts about collective responsibility on the one hand, and individualistic facts expressible in a specific language, individualistic language, which I denote by this symbol L ind, and I will say more about that later. But what that entails, if my arguments until now are correct, what that entails is that there are also no reductive explanations. So if there's no logical regularity, then there can also not be a reductive explanation of facts about collective responsibility to facts about individualistic facts in this individualistic language. Okay. Now I want to move on to the more formal part, and that builds on game models and modal logic. So I want to start with a couple of examples before giving some definitions. So here's an example of that I call toxic waste. It's basically a very simple case of overdetermination. So consider an example where two firms bring about a harm by simultaneously emitting amounts of some toxin into a river, but where no firm could have brought about the harm alone. So the harm only occurs because both are emitting these toxins. Right. Yeah. So each firm can be understood, or we can simplify this as each firm having only two options, either emitting or refraining from doing so. And then we can basically model this in a game-like structure as follows. So we have these two firms, firm one, firm two. Each has two actions, E1 and N1 for firm one, E2 and N2 for firm two. And then we have four possible outcomes, and the utilities basically represent the sort of moral dimension of these outcomes. So the outcome is only bad if both of them are emitting, right? And all the other cases, we at least for the sake of this example, assume that nothing bad is happening. So morally speaking, everything is okay. Now here's a second example, which is a case of coordination. So here, consider an example where we have two fishers that have access to a lake for catching fish. And let's assume that both decide to fish every day. Let us assume that these fishers need to fish at least every other day to provide for their family. Furthermore, let us assume that the lake's resources will deplete if and only if both fish every day. However, if both were to decide to fish only every other day, they would miss out on certain surplus, which they, let's assume, would use for various noble ends. So we can simplify the situation again as a 2x2 game. So we have two fishers, fisher one, fisher two. Each has two actions. Action AI is to fish every day. The other action BI is to fish every other day. Now, if both of them fish every day, the lake's resources will be depleted, and let's assume that that's a bad outcome. Now, if both of them decide to fish only every other day, they would miss out on the potential surplus that they would use for various noble ends. We would say that that's also not a good outcome. But then there's these other two possible outcomes where only and exactly one of them fishes every day and the other one fishes every other day. And those are the good outcomes. So this is a case of coordination where they have to sort of decide and coordinate on who will be fishing every day and who will be fishing every other day. Okay, so this brings me to the sort of models that I will be using. I'll call these collaborative game models. So they consist of a set of agents, which I assume to be finite, and every agent has a number of actions available to them, which I denote by capital AI. Now, the full set of all action profiles is often denoted by A, which is just a Cartesian product. Now, these games have a utility function, which I'll denote by D to avoid confusion with what game theorists often talk about when they talk about utility functions. So these utilities should be thought of in a sort of moral connotation. So it's a mapping from action profiles to the interval 0 and 1, and it's the same for every agent. Then one sort of unusual component perhaps is a propositional evaluation, which says for a given set of propositions, it gives you for which of these action profiles whether this proposition is true or not. So in the example that I draw on here, the purely formal example, the proposition P is true at the action profile consisting of A1 and A2, but not at the others. And proposition Q is true in the action profiles A1, B2 and B1, B2, but not in the others. Okay. These games also have probabilities, but that's on the next slide. For now, a couple of comments. So these utilities, they represent a moral code. I map these utilities on the interval 0, 1, but one can basically think of these as normalized utilities. So I don't think there is any significant difference if these utilities were unrestricted, especially because I'm considering the case with only finite agents and finite actions. Group actions, you can think of group actions as combinations of individual actions. So if in this case, for instance, the group consisting of Fisher 1 and Fisher 2 has group actions, well, one for each of these cells in the game. Uh, so basically, a group action is an individual action for each of the individuals in there. Okay, so the notation A minus G so those are actions of everyone outside of group G. And then when I have a group G, I can sort of combine a certain action, like group action of the group, and actions of the members outside or the group's non-members, individuals outside of the group. I can combine those and then I get another action profile. And that's denoted with this um, with these brackets. Okay, I hope that's clear. So probabilities, how do I model those? Well, I basically use conditional probabilities. So each agent, oh, there should be a sub I here with the P's. So each agent has a conditional probability uh, that assigns to each combination of actions of the other agents its probability, which is again a number in between 0 and 1. And then a game model is basically a collaborative game model with these conditional probability distributions, one for each agent I and one for each individual action AI. Okay. You might ask why be so permissive? That's all fine. You can think of these as just probabilities, not conditional. Everything still works. But I think these conditional probabilities, they can accommodate causal and evidential decision theory that might be relevant for some purposes. Okay. Now, linking this back to the stuff I said about sufficiency, nest conditions, etc., this is maybe a nice or a helpful conceptual picture. So basically, all possible worlds, I think of those as all possible pointed game models. And then in this sense, um, we can think about sufficient conditions as follows. So C would be a sufficient condition for E if and only if every pointed game model that satisfies C also satisfies E. And you can do similar things for nest conditions, etc. So that's how the modeling, the formal stuff links to the conceptual analysis of a logical regularity. Okay. Now the individualistic language, Ahmed, can you remind me, or one remind me of how much time I have left?
Um, Actually, your 50 minutes, we are about to finish your 50 minutes. We are very
Ah,
near.
okay.
But you
Ah,
can take 10 minutes more
okay.
if you like.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
But
Yes.
it's
Okay.
wonderful. We are listening very minutely.
Okay. Okay. Good. Excellent. Okay, but I'll try to speed up a bit then. Maybe leave some things out. Okay, so here's the individualistic language, and this is fairly standard in modal logic, the way I do things. So we have a fixed set of propositional variables, P. The language includes a negation, so we can negate any statement. We have conjunctions. Then we have several modal operators. We have one for possibility, one for individual agency, which basically represents agent I sees to it that phi. And then we also have special constants that are of the form star I, which represent that agent I maximizes their expected utility. Okay. Right. Very briefly. So possibility basically means, so we analyze the truth of these statements within a certain game model, pointed game model, I should say. So that's a game model with an action profile in the game model. So possibility basically means that it's possible that phi, if and only if there is an action profile in the game such that where phi is the case. Individual agency means that an agent sees to it that phi exactly if the agent's individual action ensures phi, regardless of the actions of the others. Now, about abilities, I will skip that in the interest of time, but I'll give you an illustration of these ideas. So if we take the same model and we look at A1, A2, then we see that P is the case, but Fisher1 is not seeing to it that P, because P is not the case at A1, B2. So A1 is not, with their action A1, ensuring that P is the case, because P could have been false. Likewise for Fisher2, so this means that propositions might be true even though nobody is seeing to it that it is true. That's what this example illustrates. Then individual rationality, again, it will be fairly brief. I assume everybody is familiar with expected utility theory, so basically I assume that individual rationality is maximizing expected utility, where utility means, or at least conceptually means, this sort of has this moral connotation. So based on that, I think we can make a connection between rationality and obligation. So in a collaborative game, the utility function represents a moral code. So basically, we can think of instrumental rationality with respect to the moral code as representing obligations. So an agent fulfills all her obligations exactly when they perform an action that is instrumentally rational with respect to the moral code. And an agent can be held morally responsible exactly when they did not fulfill all their obligations. So that's the link between game theoretical notions of rationality and more moral notions of obligations and responsibility. Or that's at least the link that I will assume. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this because I assume that people are familiar with expected utility theory. So I'm going to skip this. It will come back later. But basically what this means is that this individualistic language models every combination of actions, omissions, abilities, obligations, responsibilities, and rationality, or at least rationality with respect to the moral code of finitely many individuals. So it's a pretty expressive individualistic language. Now moving on to the collective level and skipping group agency. When it comes to collective rationality, I'm going to use a similar symbol, this star G and not star G, to represent that the group performs a collectively rational group action or a collectively irrational group action. Again, skipping group agency in the interest of time. Now, the only thing that matters for my purposes is that this notion of collective rationality meets two desiderata. The first one is a rationality desideratum, which says that whenever a group guarantees the best utility, then it performs a collectively rational group action. Or in terms of responsibility, then the group cannot be held collectively responsible. So this means that this is a sufficient but not necessary condition for collective rationality. The second desideratum is an irrationality desideratum, which says that whenever a group guarantees the worst utility, while being able to guarantee the best utility, then it performs a collectively irrational group action. Right? So again, this is a sufficient but not necessary condition for collective irrationality. So if a group ensures an outcome of 0, while it could have ensured an outcome of 1, then it's collectively irrational. That's all this says. I believe it's fairly minimal. Right, and then within this formal framework, we can ask whether we can make this reduction or whether there is this logical regularity between group obligations, group responsibility, and all the types of individual facts that can be expressed in this individualistic language. Okay, I want to go over at least this slide and then I'll move on to the impossibility result. So you can use this framework to illustrate that there is, or there can be, a collective responsibility gap, and it happens exactly in these coordination kind of cases. So this is the question of is it the case that if agent I fulfills her obligations and agent J fulfills her obligations, that then also agents I and J together fulfill their collective obligations? In terms of the language, this translates into whether it's the case that star I and star J together imply star G. And in this example, we see that the answer at least can be no, depending on how you fill in the probabilities, of course, but you can fill in the probabilities in a way that that they end up in A1, A2, while agent 1 is maximizing expected utility, agent 2 is maximizing expected utility, but together they're ensuring the worst outcome while they could have ensured the best outcome. So here, the group can be, in a sense, held collectively morally responsible. They could have done something else that would have ensured the best outcome, even though none of the members of the group can be held individually morally responsible. They all, well, were instrumentally rational with respect to the moral code, let's say. Okay, I'll skip this example then. I'll go on to the impossibility result, and I'll also skip this one. Right, let me see. So the first part of what's on this slide, I think I already said. I think I can skip this too. So then that brings me to the question. So now all we have shown with this responsibility gap example is that the particular individualistic statement star I and star J, or agent 1 fulfills their individual obligations and agent J fulfills their individual obligations, that is not sufficient for the group to fulfill its collective obligations. But we might ask, well, maybe it's a nest condition, right? It might be a nest condition. Well, to rule this out, we have to prove that there is no non-trivial set of individual facts gamma in this individualistic language, such that all gamma worlds that satisfy star I and star J also satisfy star G. Now, maybe we find that that's also not the case, but then we can ask, well, maybe there's other individualistic statements that are sufficient or a nest condition for star G, or it might be the case that star I is unnecessary or a Sezin condition for star G. So I just want to illustrate that it's pretty hard to prove that there's no logical regularity. So the basic observation we just had does not suffice to rule out any logical regularity. So the main result that we have is the following. We call this an underdetermination result. So basically what it says is that for every possible world W, there are two other possible worlds, W0 and W1, such that they agree on all individualistic facts expressible in the individualistic language, but W0 satisfies not star G and W1 satisfies star G. So what that means is that the group is collectively irrational at W0 and the group is collectively rational at W1. And these worlds are sort of indistinguishable from the perspective of individualistic facts expressible in this individualistic language. Now, with this result in hand, you can prove the impossibility result with regards to logical regularity. So with this theorem in hand, you can prove that there is actually no set gamma, no set of individualistic facts such that these facts are satisfiable and it's a sufficient condition. You can also show that there is no individualistic necessary condition. And more generally, you can also show that there's no necessary and sufficient condition, there's no nest condition, and there's also no Sezin condition. So that's the main result, and then I'll move to the conclusion. Okay, so to briefly recap, I talked about responsibility voids, which are basically situations where something bad happens and no human can be held morally responsible. I talked about collective and individual obligations and about these collective responsibility gaps where you have collective responsibility without any individual responsibility. And I've shown that you cannot have any reductive, like individualistically reductive explanation of collective responsibility. Now, you might ask how this relates to rational choice theory more generally. And I think this result can actually be generalized. So the consensus view is that rational choice theory can provide successful individualistic explanations of collective irrationality. For instance, in cases such as the prisoner's dilemma or the tragedy of the commons. But actually, in a follow-up paper, we argue that this is impossible. So using similar techniques and similar models, but more general, where utilities can be any utilities, they do not have to be linked to a moral code, that you can show that any purported individualistic rational choice theoretic explanation of collective irrationality must be unsuccessful, and the same holds for collective rationality. Now, there are some critical open questions when it comes to responsibility voids and gaps. So it might be that responsibility gaps that they can arise, but we have to think about how plausible or probable they are. I haven't really said anything about that. And this is actually an issue that is, I think, overlooked in the literatures on collective responsibility and technological responsibility gaps. And the second issue that I also already alluded to in the beginning is that of course, not all responsibility voids are morally problematic, and it's a pretty hard conceptual, let's say, challenge to demarcate the morally problematic ones from the morally insignificant or innocuous ones. And with that, I want to end my talk and thank you for your attention. I'm curious to your questions, comments, suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hein Duijf. I especially like your presentation because it's very clear and it's communicative, and whatever argument you have presented, uh, I really convinced, and though
Thanks.
though I have some questions, and
Of course.
because it reminds that we live in a society or in a world where uh, we expect that some moral events, or there are responsible things around us, but uh, uh, things are actually inverted our expectation, actually subverted our expectation, because we don't know whom to blame, we don't know who is responsible. So in my psyche, I relate your presentation to this, but there are more specific, and your logical regularity and things you have related. So I especially like your presentation, despite I have some few questions which I will raise later on. Now, I would like to invite our chair, Professor Rajat, to say something on Dr. Hein's presentation.
I think you're muted. Sorry.
Sir, Professor Rajat, please unmute. We can't hear you.
I was not quite expecting that, but let me go ahead anyway. Couple of things. One, you confine yourselves to harms and who's responsible for the harms.
Yeah.
My guess is people often take responsibility for good things that they do. That
Right.
almost everything that you have said can be presented in a dual way, where you're taking responsibility for good things that an individual or group does. Okay. That's one comment. The second is you confine yourself to two-valued logic. And often things are not as clear.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would get different outcomes if you allowed for fuzzy logic, multi-valued logic, like Maurice is not here, that he's worked on. Thirdly, the notion of group rationality
Yeah.
has been questioned. Whether
Yeah,
or
yeah.
not it makes
Mm.
sense to say that a group is rational or not, whether you can even say that, is, I think, not that clear. Uh, Another comment that I would have refers to the first example with plus signs and minus signs that you gave.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is closely connected to some political science literature. Uh, I think you can look it up. It's sometimes called Ostrogorski's paradox, where the horizontal rows represent direct voting, and the vertical columns represent people getting elected and then parliamentary voting. And that
Ah.
same sort of an example is used to capture the fact that when an outcome comes out of the parliament, each one of the laws may in fact be opposed almost unanimously or
Mm-hmm.
unanimously by the population. So there's at least a mathematical link. I
Thanks.
I think I've said enough. Uh,
Okay, good. Excellent. Yeah, let me take them from the back to
so
the
you
beginning.
shouldn't view any of this as a, you know, attack on anything that you've
No,
said.
no, 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 no. But I do want to. I mean, with regards to this political context, I want to thank you because I wasn't aware of that. So I might get back to you for references. Because I think I see the sort of structural or formal sort of analogy between the two domains, but I haven't come across people who
Just reach
use
out to me.
maybe
I'll send you a
maybe to
work
bring it on the
that
screen.
I
So
have done with David Kelsey in
let's see.
England, which actually gives a necessary and sufficient condition
Hmm.
when those kinds of paradoxes can arise with
Yeah,
with not majority but different
yeah,
proportions involved.
yeah, yeah. I am aware that this happens in sort of legal in the legal context. There's debate about this, and I think there it's might be called the doctrinal
Mhm.
paradox. But I wasn't
Yeah.
aware that it also pops up in the
If you
political
just reach out
domain
to
and
me, I'll send you a reference.
yeah, yeah, excellent, excellent. Um, Group rationality, does it make sense? Yeah, that's a very good question that I haven't sort of independently touched on. So in response to my talk, you might say, well, you're treating any sort of collection as a group, and that's too, how would you say that? Too lenient, too wide. You're overgenerating groups. There are not so many groups. Um, to that, I would say, sure. I'm happy to concede the point. But I think so. Where this sort of comes in is where people argue, sort of on independent grounds, that there is a sort of group or a group agent, and in those circumstances. I think, and even though perhaps the simplified examples I used are maybe not such cases, but there might be other cases. Perhaps this discursive dilemma case is one of those where you have committee decision making. Um, in those cases, I think you can sort of use the same sort of uh, use the sort of formal analogy between uh, what I presented and a situation in which the group act like for independent reasons, people think the group is a group agent that can be collectively rational or not.
Well,
Yeah.
again, notion of what it means to be rational is what I was questioning. But in your context,
Mm.
if you look at the literature on repeated games,
Yes.
uh, you can get a Gaussian result that because of individual rationality, expectations, and threats,
Hmm.
group rationality in your sense would emerge. Cooperation would. That was essentially called the Coase's argument.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one. One thing I do want to say, perhaps, is that so I'm trying to get the slide. So I think these two desiderata that I presented are fairly minimal. Where are they? Here they are. So this one, for instance. Um,
Yes,
so
I
so
see. What you're saying is, even though it is bad for the group,
well, in this case, it's
in some
good. This
sense,
is rational. Yeah.
morally, yeah, but I wouldn't call that rationality.
Right.
Um, because the group is not
Hmm.
a sentient uh, entity.
I see. Yeah.
So, so the criticism has been, so what does it mean to say the group is rational or not? You're giving it a particular interpretation. I have no quarrel with that.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
saying, can you talk about rationality of something that is not sentient?
Right.
Can you talk about machine rationality?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a big debate in the literature on group agency, whether agency or rationality, uh, like either of them, whether they require sentience. But these days, it's not a very odd position to say that groups can be responsible even though they're not sentient. So people would commonly argue that like you have collective responsibility of states, of corporations,
Mm.
and those are not sentient, but they are still. Then they would argue that that's a case in which you would have a collective responsibility
So,
on
so
the good.
how, in fact, often uh, courts, particularly in the US, hold
And
groups to be
not
responsible and
sentient.
then proceed to divide, like shared responsibility, that such and such is one third responsible for the damage, the other party is two-thirds responsible. They often go that way. I don't know how your model captures that.
Hmm. Well, I don't do degrees of responsibility, so my
I
model does
know.
not have it. It's
So
it's a
that's what
yes
I
or no.
was.
It's a yes or
So,
no
so,
question.
so
Yeah.
that was what I was saying, that you stick to binary logic, and
I
that
see.
sort of what they do in courts out here in the US completely rules out
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
approach.
So what I can mention is that I believe Bremen van Hees have developed a notion of degrees of responsibility. And it's been a while that I looked at it, but I think it relates to sort of power measures that are also, I believe, common in the economic literature. I I
Yeah,
forgot which measure exactly they use, but they use one of those or something that is
yeah.
formally similar to one of those power relations.
You can
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can use you can measures of different individuals' power within a game to
Yes,
claim
exactly.
that you are, because you have this much power, you're this much responsible. That's one way of going
That's
about it.
that's what they developed in newspapers. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Um, right. So that's the point about the fuzzy logic. Then maybe to the first point about praise, whether it's totally, whether you can make, whether you can sort of apply everything I said also to the praise case instead of blame, right? Looking at
Yes,
good
yes,
outcomes
yes,
instead of the
yes.
bad outcomes. So I'm a little bit hesitant on that. So I do know that it's also kind of, so in philosophy, there is this sort of, people recognize that there is this asymmetry between praise and blame. Um, Even though maybe sort of formally it's kind of hard to justify, it is sort of when you test intuitions, it seems to be that we assign praise not in a similar way as blame. So that would make me think that perhaps what I have said here does not, at least not directly, apply to praise and good outcomes. So one reason to maybe think that is that the way I talked about, I didn't mention blame, but you could think of responsibility as blame, is that the way I talked about it is that blameworthiness, for that it suffices if you haven't fulfilled all your obligations. But the dual, I think, is not intuitive. So I don't think it's the case that if you fulfill all your obligations that you're praiseworthy, right?
So then
Praise.
the question is to what extent are
Okay.
dual
The question is to
conditions?
what extent. So I think, yeah, it's not directly clear to me whether whether it's possible to sort of copy paste uh,
No,
what I
no, no, it's
said
not,
on.
may not be possible to copy, but to
Yeah.
an extent, it may be still
Yeah.
worth pursuing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with that. Yes. It's worth pursuing, but it will require some, uh, well,
Never
tinkering.
said it was easy.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, um, uh, Professor Ajuddev, can I take some questions from?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Please,
Thank
please.
you.
Kishore usually has a question.
Yes, yes. Kishore, Dr. Kishore Kanal.
Yes, yes, I am listening.
Yes.
Actually, I don't have any question because this is quite a new area for me, and I am from statistics background. I can understand a little bit about all those things, but I am
Okay.
not in the position to ask any specific questions.
Okay. No
For that,
problem.
I
No
have to
problem.
study in details, so that it will be good to ask the question based on some
Right.
good understanding. Yeah.
Of
Thank
course.
you.
Of course. Thank you. So, may I request Najma Sheikh? Invite Najma Sheikh to. Do you have any questions?
Hi. I don't have any questions, but I've been reflecting on how does one hold accountability historically? And it may be completely not related to this, but historical accountability as one moves forward.
So with what exactly do you mean with historical responsibility? Do you mean in a case of structural injustice? Like, do you have that in
Yes.
mind, or is it something completely
Yeah.
different?
Structural injustice, for example.
Right. Um, so I mean, it's hard to say, hard to give a thorough answer to this, but um, I mean, there's one question of whether there has been individual wrongdoing at certain points in history, right? And I mean, in a typical cases of structural injustice, uh, have argued there are where structural or out of accessible individuals. You're hearing me because
Dr. Hein,
you all
we,
froze. Yes.
oh, now it's okay. The connection was unstable for few
Right.
seconds.
Yeah.
Right. Now
Sorry
it's
for
all
that.
right. Right. Carry on,
Okay.
please.
Okay. Yeah. So first question, is there any doing? Probably yes. Wrongdoing, can there's yeah, what do you say in those kind of cases? And there people have tried to argue at least that there is sort of remedial responsibility. So there is a responsibility, sort of forward-looking responsibility to remedy the situation, to correct the sort of injustice or the inequality. And you can look for theories that sort of, and there's different grounds to say that, right? So you might say people might have a forward-looking responsibility to correct an injustice, to repair certain inequalities. And they might have these responsibilities even if they are not blameworthy for it or for their contribution to it. So there might be the case that some people have this forward-looking responsibility purely because they have the capacity to make these reparations. So I do think that when it comes to these sorts of structural injustices, and when you think about remedial responsibilities, I think it's a mistake to think that remedial responsibilities need to be tied to sort of blameworthy actors that contributed to the structural injustice. So that might be a case in which you say, well, how do you say that? So I think the focus of the research there should probably more be on who should remedy the situation rather than, or I mean, it's also important to look at who is responsible or who did something wrong in the process. But I think these might be two separate questions to pursue. Does that help address your question?
Yes, yes, thank you very much.
Um, can I ask Rafael Siula do you have any questions? You can.
Well, I'm really unfamiliar with this thing, so I don't have any question. Maybe, but I don't know if it's a silly question. What's the link between this model and the concept of responsibility in human rights? If there's anything that this model adds, or if there is a link between these two concepts of responsibility. Is it a meaningful question? I don't know, but
So I'm not an expert on human rights, so I'm a little bit afraid that I can't really say anything substantive on that, or I feel a little bit feels a bit
okay.
hard to say anything substantive on that. But what I can say is that, and I'm not sure if this is your concern, but so I might be missing the mark, and if I do, my apologies. But there is a debate in philosophy. So one worry you might have is that the way I set things up is very consequentialist.
Huh.
I'm not sure if that's the worry you have. But if that's your worry, then I think maybe you don't need to worry so much. There is this debate in philosophy about whether supposedly non-consequentialist theories can be, so to say, consequentialized. So whether you can sort of transform, for instance, deontology into a theory that is consequentialist in nature. And there's recent work, or maybe by now not so recent anymore, but work by Christian List and Franz Dietrich, who show that actually if you take a sort of reason-based approach to decision theory, you can actually accommodate in a well, it's not purely consequentialist, but in a sort of consequentialist in quotes way, many moral theories, even theories like deontology. But again, this might have missed the mark with regards to your question, but that's something that popped to my mind, like substantive.
But thanks for your answer. I think it was very interesting answer to my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And may I request Mohaimin Ul Kabir to, if you have any question or any comments, please unmute. Okay, then may I ask Chiranjit Das if you have any questions or comments, you can unmute and say.
Well, I'm relevantly new to this thing, so I don't have that much of commentary. Well, I also had to attend few calls, so missed few things. So I think I have to rewatch the recordings again to get
Okay.
some of these formulatic parts. Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Okay. Okay, no problem. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anyone? I did not. Anyone sleeps? If anyone wants to raise some question or comments, please do.
Yeah, Professor Ronnie.
Yes.
Yeah, I have one question for Professor Rajat. Actually, yeah, I went through some paper of Professor Rajat, and I got very much impressed because his paper are too much mathematical. I just like to ask you one question: how can we build up the skill on so that we can write a purely mathematical paper like yours?
Sorry, your question is where
So,
can, or is it not directed to me? Sorry.
Yeah. It's for Professor Rajat.
Ah,
It
sorry,
is
sorry.
for
Okay.
me. And what you're interested is in writing mathematical papers.
Yeah.
Why would you be interested in doing that? Ultimately, you want to, mathematics is just a tool. You want
Yes.
to use it to shed light, as much light as you can on a problem. So if I would recommend starting with the problem and picking up the math that you need to solve the problem, rather
Okay.
than, focusing on whatever the mathematics or even the philosophy or the logic, because it would take you way away from the problem that you're trying to solve. So start with the problem and then build the tools that you need.
Okay.
That would be
right.
my strong recommendation.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Right. So my question to Dr. Hein is that I think we can distinguish two things between accountability and responsibility, because because in the last regime in our government, that Hasina administration has been overthrown, then we see some of the officials were picked up and used for election engineering or manipulation of elections. So that has been widely published in our newspapers here. So I was thinking that that if a police officer or a presiding officer um, who is responsible for an area where the voting center is situated, so so for his job there is a certain kind of functionings that is he or she is accountable for, and there are something that actually out of his accountability boundary, there are something that whether he or she will part of this unethical functioning, that is his moral part, his or her moral part. And if anyone do the wrong things to save his job because he is in a position where some functionings has been due, otherwise he will not get the salary, or he or she will not continue her job. So what actually responsibility void explain in this situation?
So I'm not 100% sure if I understand the example or the situation you're sketching. So is that a situation in which a person has a particular role within an institution that comes with certain responsibilities with regards to certain domains? Is that the sort of
Yes,
is that the
yes.
and you're
Because
asking whether this sort of responsibility that they have, whether that's distinct from sort of
accountability and responsibility, they are two different things, because accountability is the list of things that I usually do in my job description. So
okay.
in the job description, I have to do some work, otherwise my job will not exist. They will sack me from my job. That is one thing. That are some particular duties that I have to conduct, or I have to do, perform. But there are something that beyond this job description, because whether I will take part in the certain tasks that I feel that is morally not right. So and there are opposite examples also, that if you go to a doctor, and the doctor is not responsible for preserving your previous documents, previous records, but you visited him or her, but you did not preserve the previous documents, but for taking or for right diagnosis, there are need for previous records. So if if the doctor preserves your previous record, then that task is not part of his accountability. That is his or her moral responsibility, because he or she did some extra thing which is not written in the job description. That is one example. And in Bangladesh, in the last 2024 election, because as you know, in Bangladesh, it is widely established that there are good elections where competition, participation, and elections were fair. And there are elections which are being which are not properly conducted because in 2014, 2018, and 2024, these three elections were there were not many voters in the election booths, but votes were casted 100%, 99% or 100%, because Hasina administration manipulated the election in such a way that before the election day, at night, at middle of the night, she actually put some people, government employees, to work for her to be elected, to win the election artificially, so that in the middle of the night they put a seal on the ballot paper illegally, which usual voters do not know because they are in the sleep. So these are the unethical activities. So my question was that, so if a presiding officer or an election officer who is responsible for a certain voting center, what moral dilemma he or she might face? Because a part of the duty is his or her job description, and part of the activities he clearly understands that this is not morally right. So, but he or she is participating, and some of them, there are examples that some of them revoked and withdraw themselves from such kind of activities. So for explaining moral responsibility void, so what responsibility can you explain in such two situations? The responsibility voids can be explained in such two situations? How?
Right. So I should say this reminds me of a case that really triggered a lot of this literature, and that's Germany in the Second World War, where a lot of excuses were kind of the form like, "Oh, but I just carried out my job," right? It led to all sorts of horrible, like really horrific outcomes, but many people just responded, "I was just carrying out my job. I was following orders," right?
Okay.
So the question here is, I mean, I think there's a couple of questions. So the first one is, um, is that really an excusing condition? Right? If you know and recognize that morally speaking, you should be doing something else, is it really an excusing condition that you were ordered to do something? So that's, I think, question one. If the answer to the question is no, and you still carry out the order, then I do think you can be held, and I think many people will agree that you will be morally responsible, right? There is no, even though you have, well, duties that originate from your job or your role, those are sort of canceled by the strength of the moral obligations to do something else. So there might be this conflict of obligations, one coming from morality, if you want, and other ones coming from have a different source, so perhaps your job. And I mean, one factor that plays a role here is exactly how costly it is for you to not carry out these orders. Because I mean, if it's a situation which might actually have been the case back in the Second World War, where not carrying out the orders would actually cost you your life, then perhaps it is an excusing condition, right? But if you can sort of, without any cost to yourself or anyone else, yeah, not carry out the orders, then it seems very hard to maintain that the person in that position rightfully carries out their duties in spite of acting against what morality requires. Now, second question can be, okay, so maybe, and I think this is what triggered a lot of the literature, is that there was, or at least people argue that there is either some sort of ignorance, that they don't know how they're sort of individually carrying out the orders sort of adds up to some sort of collective harm. And that might be excusing. So that might be a situation in which, right, if there are these excusing conditions, then it might be a situation in which there is a responsibility void, yes. But I do think we need to first critically examine whether it's actually the case that there are these excusing conditions in place. And I do think I mean, in many cases, it's probably hard to maintain that these excusing conditions are in place. But there might be cases, and there might be significant cases in which there is. And people have tried to make sense of that. One approach that I particularly like by philosopher Christopher Kutz, who sort of develops a separate notion, which is complicity, not responsibility, but complicity. So you can be sort of complicit in some sort of collective wrongdoing without you being morally responsible for it. So basically, because of your participation in a particular collective action, social practice, that might be enough to make you complicit in it, even if you are sort of individually blameless, if you get what I mean. Yeah.
Yes.
So
That's wonderful.
did that respond to both of
Yes.
your... Okay, good. Excellent.
Right. So I will return to our chair, Professor Rajat Deb.
Let me just pursue the point that Ronnie Bhai was raising. There are two aspects involved. One is hierarchy. When you have a hierarchic structure and something bad happens, how far up the chain are the people responsible? For instance, one of the US presidents said the buck stops here. Does the buck really stop there? If you look at the most recent controversy going on in the US, this girl gets shot by an agent who is apparently performing his duty. To what extent was the agent responsible? To what extent was the girl responsible? What extent were the bosses responsible who put the agents there? It's a very, very complicated question. And I believe the approach that the courts take out here, that sometimes responsibility has to be shared, is probably the right one. Even moral responsibility, there's shared moral responsibility.
Very insightful.
And that doesn't have anything to do with rational behavior of the group. That is another point I would like to make.
Very insightful.
Yeah. So I didn't talk about hierarchies here, but I mean, one thing that should be obvious is that in many cases, you can have multiple people responsible, right? Nothing requires that there's only one person responsible. So besides shared responsibility, there might also just be multiple people responsible in the hierarchical case. There's nothing that sort of prima facie or conceptually rules out that that's the case. Moreover, I think in the hierarchical case, I mean, it's kind of simplest in the sort of for the officer who directly sort of caused certain harms. But even for the bosses, I mean, they know that their actions involve certain risks, right? And if you endorse a view that's sort of imposing risks in an unfair way, that is enough to kind of put you on the hook as also like as one of the responsible agents, then that might suffice, right? So in that sense, I'm just saying it might suffice to only allude to individual responsibility, even though I do agree that the sort of shared responsibility also makes sense in this case, or at least seems plausible. There are also resources, let's say, within individual responsibility to say, well, maybe it's both. It's both the officer who pulled the trigger, and it's the boss. But they're responsible in different ways. One is for the sort of direct consequences, and the other one is for creating the risky situation in which these things might have happened. Yeah. If open to respond if you want.
It's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Professor Rajendra, may I request you to say some words and thanks to Dr. Hein Duijf, and with your words, we are going to conclude this session. So,
yes, thank you, Dr. Hein Duijf. Thank you, Ronnie White, and thank you, Professor Patnaik, who's not here, for making possible these sessions. With that, let me bring the session to an end. Thank you so
thank
much.
you. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Namaskar, sir.
No,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.